The desert wind drifted slowly across the wide stretch of land known as Dry Wash Creek, lifting thin streams of dust into the air. The ground was cracked and pale, scattered with stones and patches of brittle grass that had long since lost their color under the relentless sun. A narrow channel curved through the middle of the property where rainwater rushed during rare storms, but for most of the year it remained dry and silent. To most people in the county, the land was worthless. That was exactly why a group of builders had gathered there that morning. They leaned casually against their dusty pickup trucks, arms crossed, watching a young woman hammer a wooden stake into the ground with steady determination. Her name was Elena Cruz. She wore a wide hat to shield herself from the sun, and her sleeves were rolled up as she worked. Sweat glistened along her temples, but her movements remained focused and calm. One of the builders chuckled and nudged the man beside him. "So this is it," he said loudly. "The famous property she bought." Another man bent down and picked up a handful of the dry sand, letting it pour slowly through his fingers. "Looks like she paid good money for a bucket of dust." The group burst into laughter. Elena heard them, of course. The entire county had heard about her decision to file a claim on Dry Wash Creek. It had become something of a joke at the hardware store, the diner, and even the small bank downtown. Who in their right mind would spend money claiming land that flooded in the winter and dried into useless sand the rest of the year? One of the contractors walked a few steps closer, hands resting on his belt. "Miss Cruz," he called out with a grin, "you sure you didn't mean to buy the property across the road? That one actually grows grass." More laughter followed. Elena finished hammering the stake into the ground before standing up slowly. She brushed the dirt from her hands and adjusted the folded map tucked under her arm. "I appreciate the advice," she said calmly. The builder smirked. "Advice is free. But that land probably wasn't." Another man leaned against the hood of his truck, shaking his head. "You could have bought 10 good acres outside town for what you spent filing this claim." Elena turned slightly, looking out across the empty stretch of land. The dry wash curved across the property like a pale scar through the desert. Under the bright sunlight it looked exactly like what everyone believed it to be, nothing but sand and rocks. But she knew something they didn't. Her father had spent most of his life studying land just like this. He had been a geologist who believed the desert held secrets beneath its surface. When Elena was younger, he used to take her hiking across rocky hills and dried riverbeds, teaching her how to notice small details others ignored. "Every piece of land tells a story," he used to say. "Most people just don't bother listening." After he passed away 3 years ago, Elena inherited his old journals and research maps. Many nights she sat at her kitchen table studying the faded pages he had written decades earlier. One of those pages mentioned Dry Wash Creek. A simple hand-drawn map marked a specific area along the creek bed. Her father had circled it in red ink and written a short note beside it. "Buried deposit. Worth testing." At the time she found it, she wasn't sure what he meant. But the more she studied his research, the more she realized the dry creek might hide something beneath the surface. The builders were still laughing behind her. One of them shouted, "Planning to grow sand out here?" Elena looked back at them and smiled slightly. "No," she replied, "something much better." The men exchanged amused glances. "Well," another contractor said as he climbed into his truck, "good luck digging for treasure." Engines roared to life as the trucks pulled away, kicking up clouds of dust along the road. Within minutes the land was quiet again. Elena unfolded the old map and studied the red circle her father had drawn years ago. Then she walked toward the center of the wash and pushed her shovel into the dry ground. If her father had been right, the people laughing today wouldn't be laughing for long. For the next 2 weeks, Elena Cruz returned to Dry Wash Creek every morning before the sun fully rose above the desert hills. The early hours were the only time the air felt cool enough to work comfortably. By midday, the heat would spread across the land like a heavy blanket, turning the sand almost too hot to touch. But Elena didn't mind the long hours. She had waited years to understand the meaning behind the red circle on her father's old map. Each morning she parked her old pickup truck beside the dusty road, grabbed her shovel, measuring tape, and the folded map that rarely left her side, then walked down into the silent stretch of the dry creek bed. At first, the work felt slow and uncertain. The ground was exactly what everyone believed it to be, dry sand, loose dirt, and scattered rocks. Every shovel of earth seemed to prove the builders right. The wash looked as empty beneath the surface as it did above it. But Elena trusted the research. Her father had spent decades studying geological patterns across the region. His notes mentioned how ancient rivers once carved through these deserts thousands of years ago, leaving behind buried layers of minerals and stone that modern surveys often overlooked. The dry wash was once part of that ancient system. If his calculations were correct, the deposit should lie beneath the center bend of the creek bed where sediment would have naturally collected over centuries. Elena walked carefully across the marked area, measuring distances again and again to confirm the exact spot. Small wooden stakes now dotted the ground where she had taken soil samples during the previous week. The sun climbed higher as she knelt near the final stake. "This should be it," she murmured quietly. She pushed the shovel into the ground again. The first few layers came up easily, dry dirt and pale sand that crumbled in her hands. Sweat slowly rolled down her forehead as she continued digging, the repetitive motion steady and determined. Minutes passed, then an hour. The hole gradually grew deeper, but nothing unusual appeared yet. Elena paused, leaning on the shovel as she caught her breath. For a brief moment doubt crept into her thoughts. Maybe the builders had been right. Maybe the map had been wrong. But when she looked again at the red circle her father had drawn so carefully on the page, her determination returned. She drove the shovel into the ground again. Suddenly, clank. The sound rang sharply through the quiet desert air. Elena froze. Her heart skipped. Slowly, she knelt down and brushed away the loose dirt with her hands. A smooth pale surface began to appear beneath the soil. Not sand. Not loose rock. Something solid. Her pulse quickened. She reached for the small bottle of water she kept in her bag and poured it over the exposed surface. Dust washed away, revealing a bright white layer beneath. Limestone. Elena stared at it in disbelief. She cleared more dirt from the edges, exposing a wider section of the buried layer. The smooth white stone stretched farther beneath the ground than she had expected. Exactly where her father predicted. High-quality construction limestone. The realization hit her slowly but powerfully. For years, builders across the county had been importing limestone from distant quarries because local deposits were limited. And now a massive deposit lay hidden beneath the very land they had laughed at. Elena sat back in the sand, breathing heavily as the desert wind brushed across the wash. Her father had known. All those years ago, he had seen something everyone else overlooked. She looked down at the old map again, gently running her fingers over the faded ink circle. "You were right," she whispered softly. A faint smile appeared on her face. Because once the builders discovered what was buried beneath Dry Wash Creek, the jokes would stop. And the same people who laughed at her would soon be racing to reach her door. 3 weeks after Elena Cruz filed the claim on Dry Wash Creek, her quiet morning routine was interrupted by a sharp knock on her front door. The sun had barely risen over the desert hills, casting soft golden light through the small windows of her house. Elena was still in the kitchen pouring herself a cup of coffee when the second knock echoed through the hallway. She frowned slightly. Visitors were rare that early in the morning. Setting the mug on the counter, she walked to the door and opened it. 2 men stood on the porch. Both wore construction jackets and heavy work boots. Behind them, 3 dusty pickup trucks were parked along the gravel driveway. Elena leaned casually against the doorframe. "Yes?" she asked. One of the men cleared his throat. "Miss Cruz, that's me. We heard you might have discovered something on your dry wash property." Elena folded her arms lightly. "Word travels fast." The man nodded awkwardly. "Well, we were wondering if you might consider selling the land." For a moment Elena simply looked at him. "You laughed at it 2 weeks ago," she said calmly. The second man shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Well, we didn't know what was under it back then." Before Elena could respond, another truck pulled into the driveway. Then another. Within minutes the quiet morning turned into something completely different. More builders arrived. Contractors. Developers. Men she had seen at the hardware store, the diner, and even the bank. The same people who had stood beside their trucks laughing when she hammered the first stake into Dry Wash Creek. Now they stood outside her house waiting for their turn to speak. One man stepped forward holding a folder. "I'd like to make you an offer," he said. Another voice came from the crowd. "So would I." Soon a small line formed across her yard as more trucks arrived. Dust drifted through the morning air as men climbed out, straightening their jackets and gathering papers. The rumor about the limestone deposit had spread faster than anyone expected. The builders had seen the exposed stone for themselves. And they all understood the same thing. The land wasn't worthless. It was one of the most valuable pieces of property in the county. The first contractor spoke quickly. "I'll offer $200,000 for the property." Another man raised his voice immediately. 300. A third stepped forward. 400,000. The crowd murmured as the numbers climbed higher. Elena remained calm, leaning quietly against the doorframe as if she were watching a small performance unfold in front of her. One of the older developers pushed his way gently through the group. "I'll give you $1 million, he said firmly. The yard fell silent. Several builders turned to stare at him. $1 million for land everyone had mocked only weeks earlier. Elena slowly straightened. She looked at the group of men gathered outside her house. Some avoided her eyes. Others looked hopeful. A few looked nervous. She recognized nearly all of them. They were the same builders who had laughed when she first started digging. The same ones who told her she had wasted her money on a pile of sand. Elena crossed her arms thoughtfully. "You're all thinking too small," she said. Confused expressions spread across their faces. "My father studied that land for years," she continued. "The limestone layer stretches across the entire wash." A few of the builders exchanged quick glances. They were beginning to understand. The deposit wasn't just a small patch. It was massive. That meant decades of mining potential. Supply contracts, construction materials for roads, foundations, and buildings across the entire region. The land wasn't worth $1 million. It was worth far more. Elena looked at the group again and smiled slightly. "I'm not selling the property," she said. A wave of surprised whispers spread through the crowd. "But," she added, raising one finger, "I am willing to lease mining rights." The silence lasted only a second. Then the yard erupted into urgent conversations. Builders began discussing contracts, supply deals, and extraction partnerships right there in front of her porch. Within hours, Elena had negotiated agreements that would turn her small company into the main limestone supplier for construction projects across the entire county. And from that day forward, the same builders who once laughed at her decision were now knocking on her door regularly. But not to mock her. To work with her.